There is a strange mistake we make whenever we talk about Inception. We ask whether the ending is real. We debate the spinning top, the wobble, the cut to black, and every tiny detail that might prove Dom Cobb is awake or still trapped inside a dream. But what if that question is exactly the trap the movie wants us to fall into? Because Inception may not really be a film about entering other people's dreams. It may be Christopher Nolan imagining what it feels like to be a filmmaker. To build worlds inside other people's minds, control what they see, manipulate what they believe, and then disappear before they can ask where the illusion came from. That changes everything. Cobb looks like a thief, but think about his job differently. He enters a mind, studies its architecture, plants an idea, directs performers, manages timing, designs environments, and constructs an emotional experience convincing enough that the target accepts fiction as memory. His team has specialists for every stage of the operation. One designs the world. One creates the chemistry. One performs the role. One controls the rules. And one person stands at the center, coordinating the entire production. That is not just a heist crew. It is a film crew. And Cobb is not simply the thief. He is the director. Suddenly, the dream layers begin to resemble filmmaking itself. The architect becomes the production designer. The forger becomes an actor. The chemist controls the conditions of the shoot. The extractor becomes the producer trying to keep everything on schedule. And Cobb, obsessed with controlling every frame, is also the one person whose private emotional catastrophe keeps invading the production. That is why Mel matters so much. She is not merely the ghost haunting Cobb's subconscious. She represents the part of creation that refuses to remain under the creator's control. Cobb can construct cities, bend gravity, manufacture memories, and design entire realities, but he cannot edit grief out of himself. The more he tries to suppress it, the more violently it returns. And this is where Inception becomes far more unsettling than a puzzle about dreams. We are watching a man use extraordinary imagination to avoid accepting an ordinary human truth. Some losses cannot be solved. They can only be faced. Yet audiences often choose the safer question. Is the top still spinning? Is Cobb awake? Was he ever awake? Did Nolan hide a clue in the wedding ring, the children, the camera angle, or the final cut? Those questions are fun, but they also create an illusion of choice. We convince ourselves that if we can solve the mechanism, we can solve the movie. If we can identify the correct reality, we can escape uncertainty. But Nolan's greatest trick may be that there is no escape hatch. The spinning top is not necessarily a secret answer waiting for us. It is a distraction that turns an emotional ending into a mechanical puzzle. And that is where the movie's real question truly begins for us. To understand why Inception still feels so different, we have to go deeper than simply explaining what happens. Because the film works on several levels at once. On the surface, it is a science fiction heist built around impossible technology. Beneath that, it is a psychological story about guilt, memory, grief, and the terrifying persistence of the subconscious. And underneath all of that, it becomes something even more fascinating. A movie about the act of making movies. So this breakdown will begin where every great analysis should begin, with the story itself. We will follow Cobb and his team through the architecture of their mission, layer by layer, while examining how Nolan turns a complicated plot into something emotionally understandable. We will look at why each dream level exists, how the rules create tension, and why the final operation works not simply as a heist, but as a carefully constructed emotional performance. Then we will move inside Cobb's psychology. His subconscious is not just a collection of random images. It behaves like a wounded mind trying to protect itself. Mal becomes memory transformed into an antagonist, while the dream world becomes the physical expression of thoughts Cobb cannot escape in reality. Through that lens, the movie's most spectacular moments begin to reveal something deeply personal. From there, we will step outside the story and examine how Nolan created the illusion. The production design, rotating corridors, collapsing cities, practical effects, miniatures, and carefully engineered sets are crucial because Inception rarely asks visual effects to do all the work. Its worlds feel tangible because so much of them was actually built. And then there is the music. Hans Zimmer's score does more than make the action feel larger. It becomes part of the film's architecture, manipulating our perception of time, urgency, and emotional weight. Even the famous musical idea derived from Edith Piaf becomes another layer of the movie's design, connecting sound itself to the experience of time. Finally, we will ask why Inception matters beyond 2010. At a time when Hollywood increasingly relied on established franchises, Nolan managed to convince a major studio to invest blockbuster-scale resources into an original, complicated science fiction idea. That achievement is part of the film's legacy, but our central lens will remain the same throughout. Inception is not only about dreams. It is about cinema itself, how stories construct realities, how audiences willingly enter them, and how the most powerful illusion may be the one we choose to believe. There is something almost impossible to recreate about the summer of 2010. Inception arrived at a moment when going to the theater still felt like entering a shared cultural event. You could walk out after 2.5 hours and immediately hear the same question everywhere. What just happened? Friends argued about the ending. Strangers compared theories. And somewhere in the background, that enormous BRAM seemed to follow the movie into an entire decade of trailers, turning a single sound into the unofficial heartbeat of modern blockbuster cinema. But nostalgia alone is not why Inception stayed with people. The deeper reason is much more personal. Most of us understand what it means to dream about someone we have lost. A person can disappear from our everyday lives, yet somehow return perfectly in sleep. Their face is familiar. Their voice sounds right. For a few seconds, the impossible feels completely normal. Then we wake up, and the emotional truth arrives before the logical one. That is Cobb's nightmare. He is surrounded by memories that feel more real than reality itself. His subconscious can reconstruct Mal so convincingly that he keeps confusing remembering her with actually having her. And that experience is universal, even if our losses are different. Sometimes memory is comforting because it lets us revisit someone. Sometimes it is cruel because it reminds us that the visit cannot last. This is why the movie's complicated dream technology ultimately feels surprisingly human. The architecture may be impossible, but the emotion is recognizable. And there is another reason audiences became obsessed with understanding every hidden layer. Inception created a kind of cinematic FOMO. If you only watched the surface, you saw an extraordinary heist. But once you discovered the deeper connections between dream levels, memory, guilt, time, and filmmaking itself, you could never quite watch it the same way again. That experience changed the way an entire generation approached complicated movies. It encouraged audiences to pause, rewind, search for clues, debate symbolism, and question whether the director was hiding another story beneath the visible one. And perhaps that is the final irony. We entered the theater expecting to watch a movie about people entering dreams. Instead, the movie entered our own minds. More than a decade later, we are still carrying pieces of it around. Its images, its sound, its questions, and especially that spinning top. Because the greatest proof that Inception worked was never whether Cobb was dreaming. It was that we were still dreaming about the movie after we left the theater. Long before Inception became one of Hollywood's most recognizable original blockbusters, it existed as a much rougher idea in Christopher Nolan's imagination. The director had already begun thinking about dreams, subconscious intrusion, and the possibility of manipulating another person's reality years before audiences ever saw Cobb standing inside a collapsing Paris street. The earliest version emerged in the period after Insomnia, when Nolan was developing a concept about dream stealers, people capable of entering another person's dreams and taking information from the subconscious. He eventually developed the idea into an extensive treatment, reportedly around 80 pages long, but the concept was far from the sleek science fiction heist that would eventually reach theaters. In its earliest form, Nolan imagined something darker, closer to psychological horror. That makes sense when you look at his filmmaking at the time. Nolan was fascinated by unreliable perception, fragmented identity, guilt, and the frightening possibility that the human mind could become a prison. A dream, by definition, gives those ideas almost unlimited freedom. You can change geography without warning. Time can stretch or collapse. A familiar person can suddenly become a monster. The rules of reality can disappear while the dreamer continues believing everything is normal. But there was a problem. An idea that complicated could easily become incomprehensible. Nolan understood that if audiences were going to invest emotionally in a world where dreams contained multiple levels, each with different rules, the movie needed a structure familiar enough to keep them grounded. That was where the heist formula became essential. Instead of presenting Inception as an abstract exploration of dreams, Nolan began treating dreams like locations that could be infiltrated. There would be specialists. There would be preparation. There would be objectives, obstacles, timing, security systems, and consequences. The audience could understand what the characters wanted, even when the environment around them became increasingly impossible. It was a brilliant simplification. Dreams became the territory. The subconscious became the security system. And an idea became the thing everyone was trying to steal or plant. That transformation is one of the most important decisions in the film's entire development. Nolan did not make the concept less complicated. He built a familiar cinematic machine around the complication. The result was a movie that could ask enormous philosophical questions, while still functioning like a propulsive thriller. But Warner Brothers had another reason to hesitate. Inception was expensive. It was original. It contained complicated visual effects, multiple major locations, elaborate sets, an ensemble cast, and a premise that could not be explained with a simple franchise connection. There was no existing comic book mythology waiting to guarantee an audience. No famous character had already built decades of cultural recognition. The studio would have to trust Nolan himself. And then The Dark Knight changed the equation. Nolan had already proven that he could handle enormous production demands, but The Dark Knight demonstrated something far more powerful. Audiences would follow him into ambitious blockbuster territory. The film became a massive worldwide success, ultimately crossing the billion-dollar mark at the global box office. Suddenly, the director asking for a huge budget to make an original science fiction film was not an untested filmmaker with an unusual idea. He was the filmmaker who had just turned a superhero sequel into a global cultural phenomenon. That success gave Nolan the leverage to make the film he had been developing for years. Warner Brothers ultimately committed roughly $160 million to Inception, an extraordinary investment for an original screenplay with no pre-existing franchise. In today's Hollywood landscape, that decision looks almost unbelievable, but it also reveals something important about Nolan's position at the time. He had earned enough trust to make the studio believe that complexity itself could become commercially valuable. The challenge now was turning the idea into a physical reality. Nolan's longtime producing partner and wife, Emma Thomas, remained central to the production. Cinematographer Wally Pfister helped establish the film's distinctive visual language, balancing massive environments with an unusually tactile photographic approach. Editor Lee Smith would eventually become essential to the movie's intricate rhythm, especially as several timelines and dream levels had to unfold simultaneously without losing emotional clarity. And then there was Hans Zimmer. Zimmer had already collaborated with Nolan on The Dark Knight, where their work helped redefine the sound of the modern superhero film. For Inception, however, the musical challenge was different. The score needed to make time itself feel unstable. It had to create the sensation that several emotional and physical realities were moving at different speeds while remaining connected. The creative team therefore faced the same problem as the characters inside the story. How do you construct something that does not exist? Nolan's answer was not to rely on technology alone. He surrounded the impossible premise with practical filmmaking, disciplined structure, trusted collaborators, and recognizable genre conventions. The dreams could be surreal, but the emotions had to remain real. The rules could be complicated, but the objective had to be clear. And the spectacle could become enormous, but every impossible image needed a human reason to exist. That philosophy would eventually define Inception. What began as an 80-page dream-stealing horror concept had spent years transforming into something far more ambitious. A blockbuster about people constructing realities inside other people's minds. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that Nolan was not simply preparing to make a movie about dream architecture. He was preparing to build one. In the summer of 2010, Hollywood was becoming increasingly comfortable with a simple formula. Give audiences something they already recognize, make it bigger, and surround it with enough spectacle to justify the ticket price. Sequels were everywhere. Comic book adaptations were expanding into enormous cinematic universes. Remakes and reboots were becoming increasingly dependable investments. And after Avatar demonstrated the commercial power of stereoscopic 3D, the technology became one of Hollywood's favorite selling points. Studios were searching for the next guaranteed event, while original ideas increasingly looked like financial risks. Then Warner Brothers prepared to release a movie about people entering dreams. No established superhero. No best-selling novel. No recognizable franchise. No existing fanbase waiting for a trailer. Just Christopher Nolan, Leonardo DiCaprio, a complicated science fiction premise, and a production budget reportedly around $160 million. On paper, that was an uncomfortable proposition. But Warner Brothers understood that the movie's greatest weakness could also become its greatest marketing weapon. Nobody knew exactly what Inception was. The campaign did not immediately explain everything. Instead, it leaned into mystery. Posters, trailers, and promotional material presented fragments of a world where reality itself appeared unstable. Characters walked through impossible spaces. Buildings folded into themselves. People fought while gravity disappeared. A train suddenly tore through a city street. And beneath all of it was a simple invitation to become curious. Your mind is the scene of the crime. The phrase worked because it communicated the premise without explaining the machinery. What exactly was being stolen? Who was committing the crime? And what happened when the crime took place inside someone's mind? Warner Brothers also experimented with interactive promotion, including cryptic online material and puzzle-like experiences that encouraged audiences to participate rather than simply watch advertisements. The campaign helped transform the movie's complexity into part of its identity. Instead of apologizing for the confusing premise, the marketing essentially told viewers that confusion was the point. That was a dangerous strategy. Hollywood marketing usually wants to reduce uncertainty. It tells audiences what the movie is, who the hero is, what the conflict will be, and why they should care. Inception often did the opposite. It gave audiences just enough information to understand the scale of the experience, while protecting the central mystery. The trailers became puzzles themselves. And that strategy created something money cannot easily manufacture: curiosity. The visual presentation also reflected Nolan's philosophy. At a time when 3D was becoming increasingly associated with blockbuster spectacle, Inception resisted the temptation to turn the technology into the primary attraction. Nolan preferred traditional photographic formats and the physical qualities of film, including 35mm and 65mm capture for different portions of the production. That decision mattered because Inception's visual identity depended on weight. The corridors needed to feel physical. The cities needed texture. The characters needed to appear as though they were actually standing inside these environments, rather than floating through digital constructions. Nolan's filmmaking approach was built around the idea that spectacle becomes more convincing when the audience subconsciously believes there is something tangible underneath it. And this was particularly important because the movie was asking viewers to accept an enormous amount of information. Dreams could contain dreams. Time could move at different rates. A subconscious projection could attack an intruder. A kick could synchronize across multiple levels. A single action in one dream could create consequences somewhere else. That is an enormous amount of narrative machinery for a mainstream audience to process. The studio therefore faced an unusual marketing problem. The film needed to look expensive enough to justify its blockbuster scale, but revealing too much of the plot could destroy the very mystery that made people interested. The solution was to sell the experience rather than the explanation. The trailers emphasized images. The posters emphasized atmosphere. The marketing emphasized questions. And Nolan's reputation provided the missing piece of credibility. Audiences who had watched The Dark Knight knew that this director could build a complicated story without necessarily treating viewers like they needed everything explained immediately. Still, nobody could know whether the gamble would work. An original science fiction film could become the next cultural phenomenon, or it could become a spectacularly expensive experiment that audiences simply refused to understand. That uncertainty became part of the excitement. Inception was arriving in a Hollywood increasingly trained to recognize familiar brands, yet it was asking people to invest in something they had never seen before. And that made its release more than another blockbuster opening. It became a test. Could an original idea still become a global event? Could complexity sell tickets? Could a movie built around dreams compete with franchises built around characters audiences had known for decades? Warner Brothers was about to find out. And when Inception finally entered theaters, the strangest thing about the experiment was that audiences did not demand fewer questions. They wanted more. Inception begins by refusing to let us feel comfortable. Before we understand who Cobb is, what extraction means, or why anyone is fighting inside a dream, we see an older man washed onto a beach. He is exhausted, disoriented, and immediately surrounded by armed guards. They carry him through an enormous fortress until he is brought before an elderly Saito, who seems to recognize him. The strange part is that Cobb looks almost exactly as confused as we are. Then the movie cuts away. Suddenly, we are somewhere else entirely. A luxurious room, an elaborate meal, and a man being tested by someone who seems to know exactly what he is doing. Cobb and Arthur are attempting an extraction, stealing information from Sato's subconscious, while pretending to negotiate normally. This is our introduction to the basic machinery of the film. A dream has a dreamer, the person whose mind generates the environment. It has a subject, the person whose subconscious is being invaded. And it has an architect, the specialist responsible for designing the dream world and creating a believable maze. The extraction team enters that constructed environment and attempts to manipulate the subject into revealing something they are consciously protecting. But there is one more essential element: the kick. A kick is a sudden sensation capable of waking someone from a dream. Falling, being struck, or experiencing some other abrupt physical disruption can trigger the transition back toward reality. The difficulty is that once the team descends into multiple dream levels, every level develops its own relationship with time and momentum. That means escaping the dream is no longer as simple as waking up. The deeper they go, the more complicated the consequences become. And this first mission quietly teaches us another rule. Dreams are dangerous because the subconscious fights back. Sato's mind begins producing armed projections. They are not ordinary enemies. They are pieces of his subconscious responding to the presence of intruders. The more aggressively Cobb and Arthur invade the dream, the more violently the dream protects itself. Then something far more disturbing appears. Mel. She is not supposed to be there. Cobb's dead wife emerges inside the dream as a projection, but she does not behave like a harmless memory. She sabotages the operation, disrupts Cobb's control, and ultimately turns the extraction into chaos. This is our first indication that Cobb has a problem far more serious than professional failure. He cannot keep his personal life outside the dream. Mel lives inside his subconscious, and because Cobb knows how to construct dreams, his mind knows exactly how to construct her. That makes her terrifying. The same imagination that makes Cobb an exceptional extractor also gives his grief a physical form. Eventually, the mission collapses. The dream architecture fails. Saito realizes he has been manipulated, and Cobb's carefully controlled operation is exposed. Yet instead of simply punishing Cobb, Saito becomes fascinated by the possibility of what Cobb can do. He presents him with an impossible proposition. Not extraction. Inception. Cobb is asked to plant an idea inside the mind of Robert Fisher, the heir to a vast business empire. Saito wants Fisher to dismantle the company his father built, effectively destroying the corporate power that could threaten Sato's interests. The difference between extraction and inception is enormous. Extraction takes something that already exists. Inception creates something that the target believes belongs entirely to them, and that is why it is considered almost impossible. You cannot simply tell someone what to think and expect the thought to become permanent. The idea must appear to originate naturally from the person's own mind. It has to feel discovered rather than implanted. For Cobb, however, Saito offers something more valuable than money. He offers a way home. Cobb is wanted in the United States, separated from his children, and haunted by the accusation that he was responsible for Mal's death. His entire existence has become a compromise between professional brilliance and personal exile. Saito claims he can clear Cobb's legal problems and allow him to return to his children. Suddenly, the mission is no longer about a corporation. It is about a father who has spent years trying to get back to his family, and that gives the impossible job its emotional foundation. Cobb has spent his life entering other people's dreams because he cannot escape his own. Now he is being offered one final job, one final descent, one chance to return home. But before Cobb can reach his children, he will have to enter another man's mind, and somehow convince that mind to destroy itself. Cobb accepts Sato's impossible proposition, but accepting the job is only the beginning. An inception cannot be performed by one person. It requires specialists capable of constructing an entire reality, defending it, manipulating it, and keeping everyone synchronized while the laws of physics gradually fall apart. So Cobb begins assembling his team. His first major recruit is Arthur, his trusted point man. Arthur is the person who keeps Cobb grounded in the practical details, the one who understands the rules well enough to challenge Cobb when his plans become too dangerous. But for the Fisher operation, Cobb needs something more than experience. He needs someone who can build a world. That search takes him to Paris, where he encounters Ariadne, a talented architecture student whose imagination immediately catches his attention. Rather than explaining the dream world through exposition alone, Nolan lets Ariadne learn by experiencing it. Cobb brings her into a dream and asks her to design a maze. First, she creates something simple. Then Cobb challenges her. The dream suddenly becomes a classroom where architecture has no obligation to obey reality. Ariadne discovers that she can fold an entire Parisian street over itself, creating impossible perspectives and spaces that could never exist in the waking world. Buildings bend upward. Roads become ceilings. The city becomes an enormous architectural puzzle. And then comes one of the movie's most memorable demonstrations, the mirror. Ariadne creates a wall of mirrors and discovers that she can use them to duplicate space, creating the illusion that the city extends infinitely in both directions. It is beautiful, but it is also dangerous, because Cobb is not simply teaching Ariadne how to design dreams. He is teaching her how to enter his mind. The more talented she becomes, the more she begins noticing the things Cobb refuses to explain. His memories leak into the architecture. His subconscious contains places he does not want anyone else to see. One of those places is connected to Mal. Before Mal became the destructive projection haunting Cobb's missions, she was his partner in life and in dreams. Together they discovered the deepest level of dream existence. Limbo, a raw subconscious space where the normal boundaries of reality collapse. They stayed there for what felt like decades. In Limbo, Cobb and Mal built an entire world together. They created cities, streets, buildings, and memories. They experienced a lifetime while their physical bodies remained elsewhere. But eventually Cobb realized they had to leave. Mel did not want to. For her, the dream had become more convincing than reality. The world they had constructed felt complete, familiar, and emotionally real. Cobb understood that it was an illusion, but Mel could no longer accept that distinction. To make her leave, Cobb performed the most dangerous form of Inception imaginable. He planted an idea inside her mind, the idea that her world was not real. It worked, but it worked too well. After they escaped limbo and returned to reality, Mel continued believing that the waking world was another dream. She became convinced that death was the only way to wake up. Her belief eventually led to her suicide and Cobb's life being shattered beyond repair. That history explains why Cobb fears Inception. He knows exactly how powerful an idea can become once it takes root. Meanwhile, the team continues to grow. In Mombasa, Cobb recruits Eames, a skilled forger capable of perfectly impersonating other people inside dreams. Eames does not simply copy faces. He understands behavior, mannerisms, and identity well enough to become another person psychologically. Then comes Yusuf, the chemist. His contribution is essential because the Fisher operation requires unusually powerful sedation. Ordinary dream technology will not be enough. The team needs to remain unconscious long enough to descend through several dream layers, while still maintaining the possibility of synchronized kicks. And that introduces one of the movie's most important rules. Time compounds. The deeper you descend into dreams, the slower time appears to move relative to the level above. Minutes become hours. Hours become days. Days can become years. That means the team is not simply planning one operation. They are planning several operations occurring simultaneously at different speeds. Totems help characters distinguish their own reality from someone else's dream, while subconscious projections act like immune responses, attacking intruders who do not belong. Every rule exists for a reason. Every advantage has a cost. And every deeper layer increases the danger. Cobb now has his architect, his point man, his forger, and his chemist. The team is almost complete. But Ariadne has already discovered the one thing Cobb has been trying to hide. The greatest threat inside the mission will not be Fisher's subconscious. It will be Cobb's. The plan finally begins on an ordinary commercial flight to Los Angeles. That normality is important. Outside the window, everything looks familiar. Passengers sit in their seats, engines hum, attendants move through the cabin, and Robert Fisher appears to be simply another wealthy businessman traveling across the country. But beneath that ordinary surface, Cobb and his team are preparing to conduct one of the most complicated psychological operations imaginable. The objective is simple to state. Enter Fisher's subconscious. Descend through several dream levels. Plant an idea. Wake up. But the execution is anything but simple. Yusuf's sedative is administered, and Fisher falls unconscious. One by one, the others follow. Suddenly, the airplane cabin disappears and the team awakens inside the first constructed dream. They are in a city, and it is raining. This is level 1, the dream created by Yusuf. It initially looks like a familiar urban environment, but almost immediately something goes wrong. Fisher's subconscious security system recognizes the intrusion. Armed projections begin appearing throughout the streets. Not confused civilians. Trained soldiers. They surround the team with coordinated fire, tactical movement, and overwhelming force. Cobb immediately understands the problem. Fisher has been trained to protect his mind. The man they thought they were targeting as an ordinary businessman has undergone subconscious security training. His mind has been prepared for exactly this kind of invasion. The result is one of the film's cleverest reversals. Usually, the dream team controls the environment while the subject struggles to understand what is happening. Here, the subject's subconscious fights back. And it fights like an army. The team responds by kidnapping Fisher and taking him away from the immediate attack. But this is no longer a controlled extraction. Every second of the operation becomes a negotiation between Cobb's planning and Fisher's defensive instincts. Then the stakes become even more terrifying. Because of Yusuf's unusually powerful sedative, dying inside the dream does not simply mean waking up. It means falling into limbo. Under normal circumstances, a dreamer's death could trigger awakening. But here, the sedation suppresses that natural escape mechanism. If someone dies while deeply sedated, their consciousness could become trapped in the raw subconscious space beneath the constructed dream levels. And time in limbo is almost meaningless. A few hours in reality could feel like decades. The possibility transforms every gunfight into something more than a conventional action sequence. The characters are not merely trying to survive. They are trying not to disappear. Cobb knows that Fisher must believe the entire situation is connected to his own subconscious. The team cannot simply force the idea into him. Inception requires emotional logic. That is why the kidnapping becomes part of the manipulation. Fisher is made to believe that his subconscious is being attacked by enemies trying to steal information. Cobb and the others then position themselves as people capable of helping him uncover the truth. The target must eventually participate in his own psychological transformation. That is the central paradox of Inception. You cannot simply give someone an idea. You have to create the circumstances in which they think they discovered it themselves. So the team begins planting the first pieces of the emotional seed. Fisher's relationship with his father becomes the key. The goal is not simply to convince him that his father's business should be destroyed. That would be too obvious, too artificial. The idea must connect to something already buried inside Fisher. His complicated relationship with his father, his need for approval, and his fear that he will never become his own man. The team therefore begins constructing a new interpretation of Fisher's memories. His father's empire must stop representing inherited power. It must become a symbol of a life Fisher does not want to continue. And if the team can make Fisher believe that breaking apart the empire is actually an act of independence, the idea may survive after the dream ends. But before they can reach that conclusion, they have to survive the first layer. The rain intensifies. The soldiers keep coming. The city becomes a battlefield. And above them, in another dream level, time is already beginning to move differently. The mission has barely started. Yet the clock is already running in 3 separate realities. The first dream level is already collapsing into chaos. But the operation cannot stop. Because while Yusuf's rainy city continues to unfold, the team has already descended into level 2. The hotel. Here Arthur takes control of the dream. The environment is quieter, more controlled, and deliberately luxurious. But beneath the polished surfaces, the same psychological war is taking place. Cobb uses a strategy called Mr. Charles. Instead of continuing to hide the truth from Fisher, Cobb pretends to reveal it. He tells Fisher that they are inside a dream, and that Cobb is actually working as part of Fisher's subconscious security system. The apparent confession makes Fisher trust him because it gives him information he believes he has discovered himself. It is classic Cobb. He does not simply deceive Fisher. He manipulates Fisher into believing that the deception was his own discovery. This is the difference between controlling someone and planting an idea. The team now moves Fisher toward the next level. But the 3 dream worlds are becoming increasingly connected. Back in level 1, Yusuf is driving the van through the city while armed projections pursue them. Eventually, the vehicle reaches a bridge and begins plunging toward the water. That moment creates a bizarre consequence above them. In level 2, gravity begins disappearing. Arthur is inside the hotel when suddenly the floor no longer behaves like a floor. The entire hallway rotates around him. Walls become ceilings. The environment turns into a constantly shifting tunnel of weightlessness. And Arthur has to keep fighting. What makes the sequence so memorable is that the spectacle is not simply visual. It is mechanical. The choreography exists because another dream level is physically falling. As Yusuf's van falls, Arthur's dream loses its normal gravitational stability. The chaos of one layer becomes the physical condition of another. Arthur is therefore forced to improvise. He fights enemies while floating through the rotating corridor, pushing against walls, grabbing surfaces, and using momentum instead of gravity. The famous hallway battle becomes a perfect example of Inception's central filmmaking philosophy. An impossible visual effect is created from a physical problem that the characters themselves have to solve. Arthur eventually discovers a way to create a kick for Fisher, and the others despite the unstable environment. The elevator becomes part of the solution, allowing him to generate a sudden upward force that can synchronize with the transitions occurring across the dream levels. It is absurd. It is ingenious. And it works because the movie has spent so much time establishing the rules. The audience understands why the hallway is rotating. We understand why Arthur is floating. And we understand why the timing matters. The spectacle has narrative logic. Meanwhile, the team reaches level 3. Eames controls this dream, transforming the environment into a massive snow-covered fortress. The elegant hotel is gone. The urban battlefield is gone. Now the mission becomes a military assault. The team advances toward Fisher's subconscious vault, while the fortress defenders fight back. Everything depends on timing. In level 1, the van is falling. In level 2, Arthur is struggling without gravity. In level 3, the team is trying to break into the final target. And beneath all of them is the terrifying possibility of limbo. The mission becomes a synchronized chain reaction. One mistake above can destroy everything below. Then Cobb's greatest weakness appears again. Mel. She enters the fortress like a memory that has learned how to become a weapon. She finds Fisher and shoots him before the team can complete the inception. Fisher's body collapses, and because of the sedation he does not wake up. He falls downward, toward limbo. Suddenly, the mission has changed completely. The team was supposed to plant an idea inside Fisher. Now they have to find him before his mind disappears into a place where time itself loses meaning. The operation is no longer merely about controlling Fisher's subconscious. It is about rescuing him from Cobb's. Fisher is gone. His body has disappeared into limbo, and with the mission already destabilized across multiple dream levels, Cobb faces the consequence he has been avoiding since the beginning. To save Fisher, he and Ariadne must descend into the deepest possible layer of consciousness. Limbo. This is not simply another dream level. It is a place where the normal structure of reality has almost completely disappeared. Cobb has already been here before, and the world waiting for him is built from the ruins of his own memories. Cities stretch endlessly into the distance. Buildings stand beside unfinished structures. Streets appear familiar but strangely empty. Everything looks like a civilization assembled from fragments of a life that Cobb once shared with Mal. It is beautiful, and it is decaying. That contrast defines Limbo. Cobb created this world with Mal when they spent what felt like decades together, inside their shared subconscious. They built an entire reality, but eventually Cobb understood that they were prisoners of it. Mal did not. And now her projection remains here, preserved inside the architecture of Cobb's guilt. Ariadne finds Fisher and helps guide him toward the emotional revelation the team needs. But Cobb knows that rescuing Fisher is only part of the problem. He has to confront Mal. She appears as the same woman he remembers, but Cobb finally stops treating her as though she is actually Mal. He understands the difference. The woman standing in front of him is his projection, his memory, his guilt, his unfinished grief. And Cobb finally admits the truth he has spent years trying to avoid. He was the one who planted the original idea inside Mal's mind. When they were trapped in limbo, Cobb needed to convince her that their world was not real. So he introduced the idea that the reality they were experiencing was only a dream. The idea worked so completely that Mal could no longer trust reality after they returned. Cobb's attempt to save her became the thing that destroyed her. That is the deepest wound in the entire story. And for the first time, Cobb stops trying to rewrite it. He cannot undo what happened. He cannot bring Mal back. He cannot erase the memory. He can only accept that she is gone. So he lets her go. That emotional decision is the real climax of Inception. Not the explosions. Not the snow fortress. Not the rotating hallway. Cobb finally stops confusing memory with responsibility. Above them, the rest of the operation is reaching its final synchronization. The van crashes toward the water in level 1. Arthur prepares his elevator kick in level 2. The fortress collapses in level 3. And in Limbo, Cobb and Ariadne prepare to return. The entire movie now becomes a chain of carefully timed transitions. For realities. For different experiences of time. One final escape. The kicks arrive in sequence, each one triggering the next stage of awakening. The van hits the water. Arthur's elevator provides the necessary jolt. The fortress detonates. Cobb and Ariadne escape Limbo. Fisher returns to the final dream level and reaches the emotional conclusion the team has been constructing. He encounters the memory of his father and interprets his father's final message not as a demand to continue his empire, but as permission to become his own person. The Inception has worked. The idea feels like Fisher's. That is the point. Meanwhile, Cobb stays behind long enough to find Saito. The elderly man from the opening scene is finally revealed as the consequence of all those years spent in Limbo. Cobb reminds him of their agreement, and Saito eventually recognizes the promise he made. They return. The airplane cabin comes back into focus. One by one the team wakes. Cobb arrives in Los Angeles and passes through U.S. Customs. For the first time in years he is not stopped. He walks toward his home. His children are outside. Cobb sees them, and the emotional weight of the entire journey suddenly collapses into one simple image. The father finally returning to the people he has spent the entire movie trying to reach. But Nolan refuses to give us a conventional confirmation. Cobb places his totem on the table. The spinning top begins to turn. He looks at it. Then he looks away. His children appear. Cobb chooses them. The camera remains on the top. It spins. It wobbles. And just before we can see whether it falls, the film cuts to black. The question appears to be whether Cobb is dreaming. But emotionally, the answer has already been given. He no longer cares. And neither should we. Because the final image is not really asking whether reality is real. It is asking whether a person who has spent years trapped inside his own memories can finally choose to live again. Dom Cobb is introduced as a man who appears to be completely in control. He understands the rules of dreams better than almost anyone. He can construct elaborate plans, predict subconscious defenses, manipulate targets, and coordinate an operation across multiple layers of reality. When something goes wrong, Cobb immediately starts calculating a solution. But underneath that control is a man who has lost control of the one thing that matters most: himself. Cobb's tragic flaw is not simply that he misses Mal. It is that he cannot forgive himself for what happened to her. He knows that he planted the idea that their world was not real. He knows that this idea contributed to Mal's inability to accept reality after they returned. And because Cobb understands the power of ideas better than almost anyone, he cannot escape the belief that he caused her death. That guilt becomes the engine of his subconscious. Mal appears because Cobb refuses to let her become only a memory. He keeps rebuilding her. He keeps arguing with her. He keeps trying to explain himself to someone who no longer exists. Every time he enters another person's dream, his own unresolved past finds a way to enter with him. This creates the central contradiction of Cobb's character. His surface goal is simple: get home to his children. His deeper need is much harder. He needs to release the past. At the beginning of the story, Cobb believes returning home will solve everything. If he can complete one final job, clear his legal problems, and see his children again, perhaps his life can finally become normal. But Inception gradually reveals that physical distance is not his real prison. His mind is. Cobb could return home and still remain emotionally trapped inside the memory of Mal. He could sit beside his children while continuing to live in a world dominated by guilt. The journey therefore becomes less about crossing an ocean and more about escaping a psychological loop. This is where Cobb's resemblance to a film director becomes especially meaningful. He wants to control everything: the environment, the timing, the people around him, the information the team receives, even the emotions of his target. He behaves like a director who believes that if every element of the production can be controlled, the final result can be controlled too. But filmmaking, like dreaming, is never completely obedient. Actors improvise. Sets fail. Machines break. Performances reveal emotions that were never planned. And in Cobb's case, his own subconscious refuses to follow the script. Mal is the ultimate unplanned element. No matter how carefully Cobb constructs the dream, she can appear without permission. She destroys his plans precisely because she represents something he cannot direct: grief. That is why his obsession with control becomes tragic rather than impressive. The more he tries to control his dreams, the more obvious it becomes that he cannot control himself. Leonardo DiCaprio's performance is essential to making this contradiction believable. The film surrounds Cobb with enormous concepts: subconscious architecture, dream layers, altered time, impossible physics, and the possibility of living for decades inside a mental construction. Yet DiCaprio rarely plays those ideas as science fiction abstractions. He plays exhaustion, regret, fear, longing. When Cobb sees his children, the emotion is not the triumphant reaction of an action hero completing a mission. It is the fragile response of a father who has spent years imagining a moment he was never sure he would experience again. His grief also gives the movie's intellectual machinery a human center. Without Cobb, Inception could have been an impressive puzzle about dreams. With Cobb, the puzzle becomes a story about why human beings sometimes prefer memories to reality. That is what makes his final choice so important. When Cobb sees the spinning top, he could investigate it. He could wait for it to fall. He could demand certainty. Instead, he walks away. For a man who has spent his entire life trying to determine what is real, that decision represents his greatest act of freedom. He chooses presence over proof. He chooses his children over the puzzle. And perhaps for the first time, he chooses a future that does not require him to keep punishing himself for the past. Cobb begins the film believing that control will save him. He ends it understanding that letting go might. Mal appears to be the antagonist of Inception, but calling her a villain misses the tragedy of what she actually represents. She is not an enemy who entered Cobb's life. She is a memory Cobb refuses to release. Every time Mal appears, she behaves like a person, but she is fundamentally a projection generated by Cobb's subconscious. She knows his weaknesses because she comes from his mind. She understands exactly how to destabilize him because she is built from his memories, his guilt, and his unresolved grief. In that sense, Mal becomes the ultimate femme fatale. But she is a strange version of one. Traditional femme fatale manipulate the protagonist through desire. Mal manipulates Cobb through memory. She does not tempt him toward another life. She pulls him backward toward the life he lost. Her danger comes from familiarity. Cobb knows her face. He knows her voice. He remembers how she moves. And because the projection is constructed from genuine memories, it can feel more emotionally convincing than anything else inside the dream. That makes Mal almost impossible for Cobb to defeat. He cannot simply kill her projection and move on, because killing her does not remove the source of the projection. The source is him. Her death is also the most devastating consequence of Cobb's understanding of Inception. When Cobb and Mal were trapped in limbo, Cobb planted the idea that their reality was not real. He did it because he needed to convince Mal to leave their constructed world. The idea succeeded. But once they returned to reality, Mal could not remove it from her mind. She continued believing that the waking world was another dream. Her perception of reality had been permanently damaged. Eventually, she convinced herself that death was the only way to wake up. That is what makes her suicide so tragic. Cobb did not intend to destroy Mal. He intended to rescue her. His attempt to save the person he loved became the mechanism that convinced her to die. And Cobb spends the rest of the movie trapped inside that contradiction. He loved her. He harmed her. He misses her. He fears her. He blames himself. Mal therefore becomes less of a conventional antagonist and more like a psychological punishment Cobb carries everywhere. But while Cobb's story is driven by guilt, Robert Fisher's story is driven by something different: the need for approval. Fisher initially appears to be the target of the entire operation, but the deeper the team enters his subconscious, the more clearly we understand that he is also the emotional center of the mission. His relationship with his father is fractured. Fisher has inherited enormous wealth and power, but money cannot provide the emotional validation he wants. He wants to know whether his father respected him. He wants to know whether he was ever truly seen as his own person. That is why the Inception works. Cobb's team does not simply convince Fisher to destroy a company. They give him an emotional interpretation that allows him to redefine his relationship with his father. Breaking apart the empire becomes an act of independence. The idea feels like liberation rather than sabotage. And that distinction is crucial. If Fisher simply believed that destroying the company would make him richer, the idea would feel artificial. Instead, the team constructs an emotional catharsis around his deepest insecurity. Fisher believes he is finally becoming the man his father wanted him to become. The irony is brutal. He has been manipulated into believing that manipulation is personal freedom. And this creates one of the movie's most uncomfortable moral questions. Is the Inception justified? The team is not saving Fisher. They are changing him. They enter his subconscious without permission, manufacture emotional experiences, manipulate his memories, exploit his relationship with his dead father, and plant an idea that will influence the direction of his entire life. And they do it because Saito wants a business empire dismantled. There is no heroic moral framework that completely cleans this up. Fisher may emerge emotionally stronger, but that does not erase the violation. The movie asks us to sympathize with Cobb because we understand his reasons, while simultaneously making us uncomfortable with what he is willing to do to another human being. That tension is essential. Inception is a story about the power of ideas, but it never fully tells us that power is good. An idea can liberate, an idea can destroy, an idea can heal a wounded person, and an idea can be planted without consent and become indistinguishable from the person's own identity. Mal proves the danger. Fisher proves the effectiveness. Cobb proves the guilt. Together, they reveal the darker truth beneath the fantasy of entering dreams. The most frightening thing about controlling another person's mind is not that you can make them believe a lie. It is that, if you do it well enough, they may never know the difference. If Cobb represents the director, then the rest of Inception's central team begins to look remarkably like a film production. That comparison makes the ensemble easier to understand because every character has a specialized function. They are not simply there to help Cobb complete the mission. Each one represents a different part of the filmmaking process, and their personalities reflect the responsibilities they carry. Ariadne, played by Elliot Page, is the most obvious audience surrogate. She is the architect, but she is also the character who enters Cobb's world without already knowing all of its rules. Like the audience, she has questions. Why are dreams constructed this way? Why does Cobb refuse to discuss Mal? What happens when the subconscious becomes unstable? And why does Cobb keep building spaces connected to memories he claims he wants to escape? Her role as architect makes her responsible for designing the environments, but her deeper purpose is psychological. Ariadne forces Cobb to explain himself. She is the one person willing to challenge him when everyone else is focused on completing the job. The more she explores his subconscious, the more she realizes that the greatest danger to the mission is not Fisher's mind. It is Cobb's. Arthur, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, operates almost like the production manager or stunt coordinator. He is obsessed with logistics. Where Cobb is driven by instinct and emotional urgency, Arthur wants procedures. He checks the details, questions the plan, and prepares for contingencies. He is the person most likely to ask whether something will actually work rather than whether it sounds impressive. That makes his relationship with Cobb important. Cobb is the visionary. Arthur is the person who has to make the vision function. The zero-gravity hotel sequence is therefore a perfect expression of Arthur's personality. When the environment stops obeying normal physics, Arthur does not panic and abandon the plan. He calculates. He improvises. He adapts. Even while floating through a rotating corridor, he is still thinking about timing. That is what makes him more than comic relief or a secondary action hero. He represents the practical side of filmmaking. Choreography, continuity, timing, and execution. Then there is Eames, played by Tom Hardy. Eames is the actor. His specialty is imitation. He can become another person inside the dream, not simply by changing his appearance, but by understanding how that person behaves. His talent is performance. And unlike Arthur's precision, Eames brings charm. He jokes. He provokes. He seems almost amused by the absurdity of the mission. That personality creates an important tonal balance. Without Eames, the film could become overwhelmingly serious. His confidence gives the team a sense of looseness, even when the stakes are enormous. But his function is also thematically important. Inception is obsessed with performance. Characters are constantly pretending to be someone else. Cobb pretends to control the situation. The team pretends to be part of Fisher's subconscious. Eames pretends to be other people. And Fisher eventually performs an emotional interpretation of his own father. In a movie about constructing realities, the actor becomes one of the most powerful people in the room. Yusuf, played by Dileep Rao, represents another part of the production. Technical craft. His chemistry creates the conditions that allow the mission to function at multiple dream levels. Without him, the team's elaborate architecture would collapse under the limits of ordinary sleep. But his contribution also creates the film's greatest danger. The sedative is powerful enough to keep the team unconscious through the entire operation, yet dangerous enough that death inside the dream could send someone into limbo. The technical solution therefore creates the central risk. That is a familiar principle in filmmaking. Every new tool creates new possibilities, but it can also introduce new problems. And then there is Saito, played by Ken Watanabe. If Cobb is the director, Saito is the financier. He provides the reason the production exists. He has the resources, the motivation, and the authority to make the impossible project happen. His involvement turns the dream operation into a commercial transaction. Saito wants Fisher's company dismantled because it serves his own interests. And that makes the metaphor uncomfortable. A filmmaker may have a vision, but a production still needs money. A director may control the creative process, but the person funding the project can determine whether it gets made at all. Saito therefore represents the studio power behind the spectacle. Together, the team creates a miniature version of filmmaking itself. Ariadne designs the world. Arthur manages the mechanics. Eames performs. Yusuf provides the technical foundation. Saito provides the money. And Cobb directs the entire production. But the metaphor becomes even more interesting because every member of the crew depends on everyone else. Ariadne's architecture is useless without Arthur's coordination. Arthur's timing means nothing without Yusuf's chemistry. Eames's performance cannot work without Cobb's strategy. And none of them would be there without Sato's investment. That interconnectedness is exactly what makes Inception's ensemble so effective. It feels less like a group of side characters and more like a functioning creative crew. And at the center stands Cobb, trying to direct everyone else while discovering that the one performance he cannot control is his own. The deepest idea in Inception is not that dreams can be shared. It is that ideas can survive inside us long after the person who planted them, the moment that created them, or the evidence that supported them has disappeared. Cobb understands this better than anyone. He describes an idea as something like a virus. Small, persistent, and capable of growing until it changes an entire mind. That metaphor gives the movie its real power because human lives are often shaped by thoughts we barely remember acquiring. A sentence from a parent can become an adult's insecurity. A moment of rejection can become a lifetime of ambition. A memory can become a belief, and a belief can eventually become an identity. Fisher's story demonstrates both sides of that process. The team plants an idea inside him, but they do not invent his emotional wound. The wound already exists. They simply construct a path that allows him to interpret it differently. His father's memory becomes the doorway through which a new identity can emerge. That is why Inception works dramatically. The idea does not feel like information, feels like revelation. And this is where the movie's exploration of grief becomes inseparable from its exploration of art. Dreaming allows Cobb to revisit what reality has taken away. In dreams, Mal can speak again. His children can appear exactly as he remembers them. Entire cities can be rebuilt from fragments of memory. The mind becomes a private cinema in which the dead can temporarily return. A memory can comfort us because it preserves someone we have lost. Yet the same memory can imprison us if we begin preferring the reconstruction to the life that remains. Cobb has effectively turned his grief into a film that never stops playing. Every time Mal appears, he is watching another version of the same unresolved scene. Inception understands that imagination can help us process pain. Stories, dreams, photographs, music, and memories allow people to approach emotions that may be too overwhelming to confront directly. Art can create distance from suffering while still allowing us to feel it. But distance can become avoidance. A beautiful illusion can become a prison precisely because it is beautiful. This leads to the film's most persistent question. What makes reality real? The movie never gives us a simple answer. Instead, it explores perception. If an experience feels completely authentic to the person experiencing it, does its external status matter? If a memory changes your behavior, does it matter whether the memory is accurate? If you build your identity around something you believe happened, can certainty ever be separated from truth? Cobb's tragedy is that he knows the difference intellectually, but cannot always live according to it emotionally. Mal represents the extreme danger of this problem. She becomes so convinced that reality is a dream that she treats death as an escape. Her perception overwhelms every external argument. The belief becomes more powerful than the world around her. And that is why the final question is so carefully designed. The spinning top offers a test of reality, but Cobb eventually refuses to take the test. He walks toward his children instead. In doing so, he rejects the endless demand for certainty. We live through perception. We construct meaning from incomplete information, remember selectively, and tell ourselves stories about who we are. Inception simply turns that ordinary psychological process into science fiction. Its dream worlds are exaggerated versions of the worlds people already built inside their heads. And perhaps that is why the film remains so haunting. The danger is not that someone could enter our dreams and plant an idea. The more realistic danger is that we can do it to ourselves. We can repeat a fear until it becomes a fact. We can revisit a memory until it becomes more vivid than the present. We can protect an old version of ourselves because changing it would mean admitting that the past is gone. Cobb's journey therefore becomes a lesson about emotional reality. Healing does not require destroying memories. It requires changing our relationship with them. He does not need to forget Mal. He needs to stop living with her. That distinction is the heart of Inception's catharsis. The film begins by treating the mind as a place that can be invaded, manipulated, and controlled. But by the end, it suggests that the hardest person to free is not someone else's mind. It is your own. Inception's visual language is almost as carefully constructed as its plot. Every dream level has its own physical identity, but the film repeatedly returns to the same ideas: gravity, water, architecture, color, and objects that allow characters to question what they believe is real. The most famous of these objects is the totem. Cobb's spinning top appears to be a simple toy, but within the story it becomes a psychological tether. In theory, a totem allows its owner to recognize whether they are inside someone else's dream. Cobb's top was originally Mal's, which makes its symbolism much darker. The object that once belonged to the woman whose perception of reality was destroyed eventually becomes Cobb's instrument for testing reality. That makes the top less reliable emotionally than it appears mechanically. It is supposed to provide certainty, yet it is connected to the person who taught Cobb how dangerous certainty can become. Arthur's loaded die serves a similar function. Its altered weight is known only to Arthur, meaning that another person should not be able to reproduce its behavior accurately. The object represents private knowledge, a small piece of reality that belongs exclusively to the person carrying it. Ariadne's chess piece extends the same idea. Each totem reflects the relationship between identity and perception. These objects are not magical proof of reality. They are personal anchors. And that distinction matters. Inception repeatedly suggests that objective reality may be difficult to prove, but subjective reality is impossible to ignore. Then there is water. Water appears whenever control begins to fail. Yusuf's van crashes toward a river, the hotel reacts to disturbances above it, and the characters repeatedly encounter water at moments of transition. Water becomes both a physical threat and a visual representation of awakening. It surrounds the characters when the boundary between one state of consciousness and another begins to collapse. Gravity works in a similar way. The rotating hotel corridor is not simply an impressive action sequence. It visualizes the instability of a dream whose upper level has lost control. When gravity disappears, the audience experiences the consequences of another reality, even though the characters are physically somewhere else. Nolan also uses architecture to represent the mind itself. Ariadne's impossible constructions demonstrate that dreams do not need to obey normal spatial logic. The folding Paris streets transform the city into a physical puzzle. The Penrose staircase takes that concept even further, creating a structure that appears to rise forever, while secretly returning to its starting point. It is an architectural paradox, but it is also a psychological one. Cobb is trapped in exactly the same kind of loop. He keeps moving forward through memory, while repeatedly arriving at the same grief. The dream levels themselves are also differentiated through color and texture. Level 1 has the grayness of rain, concrete, and overcast streets. It feels unstable and exposed, matching Yusuf's increasingly chaotic environment. Level 2 shifts toward warmer hotel colors, with gold, brown, and amber tones creating an atmosphere of artificial comfort. The hotel appears controlled and elegant, but its polished surfaces hide the instability beneath them. Level 3 moves into blue and white. The snow fortress feels colder, harsher, and more militarized. The environment strips away the warmth of the hotel and reduces the world to survival, strategy, and objective. Then Limbo becomes almost timeless. Its palette of pale stone, white surfaces, and muted architecture makes it feel less like a living world than the remains of one. Cobb and Mal's enormous constructed city resembles a civilization after memory has begun to decay. That is why the visual design never feels decorative. The environments are psychological maps. Rain represents instability. Gravity represents connection between levels. Water represents transition. Architecture represents thought. Totems represent personal certainty. And color quietly tells us where we are before the characters ever explain it. Inception therefore uses spectacle as a form of storytelling. The impossible images are not interruptions from the narrative. They are the narrative made visible. The movie asks us to imagine what the subconscious might look like. Nolan's answer is architecture. Cities fold because thoughts can fold. Stairs loop because trauma can loop. Gravity disappears because certainty can disappear. And memories become buildings because inside Cobb's mind, the past is not somewhere he visited. It is somewhere he is still living. The most fascinating way to understand Inception may be to stop treating dreams as the movie's subject and start treating them as its metaphor. Because what happens inside a dream is remarkably similar to what happens inside a movie theater. You enter a dark room. You sit beside strangers. For several hours, you accept a reality that does not physically exist. You watch people who are not actually in front of you experience events that never happened, yet your body responds as though those events are real. Your heart races. You become frightened. You laugh. You feel grief for fictional people. The screen becomes a shared mental space. That makes cinema itself a kind of collective dream. Nolan's characters enter dreams by surrendering consciousness to a controlled environment. Audiences do something surprisingly similar every time they sit down to watch a film. We temporarily agree to accept the rules of another person's imagination. A city can fold. Time can slow down. Gravity can disappear. A person can die and return through a memory. We accept all of it because the filmmaker has constructed the illusion convincingly enough. That is why Inception's metacinematic interpretation is so powerful. Cobb's team behaves like filmmakers because they are building experiences for other people's minds. Ariadne designs worlds. Eames performs identities. Arthur manages timing and logistics. Yusuf creates the chemical conditions. Cobb directs the entire experience. And the audience occupies Fisher's position. We enter without controlling the environment. We trust the people constructing the world. We accept information because the movie gives us reasons to accept it. The difference is that the film eventually asks whether we actually need proof. This is most obvious in the final scene. Cobb spins the top. It becomes the ultimate test. If it falls, he is awake. If it continues spinning indefinitely, he is dreaming. But Cobb does something that seems almost irrational for a man obsessed with reality. He walks away. He does not wait for the answer. That moment can be interpreted as Cobb finally choosing his emotional reality over his need for objective confirmation. The top no longer controls him because the question it represents no longer controls him. For most of the film, Cobb treats certainty as salvation. At the end, he treats uncertainty as something he can live with. That is a profound change. The film also invites another interpretation through Cobb's wedding ring. Fans have long observed that Cobb appears to wear his wedding ring in dream sequences while it is absent in many waking scenes. If treated as an intentional visual clue, the ring becomes another possible indicator of Cobb's psychological state. His marriage exists primarily in memory, and the ring therefore becomes a visual connection to the reality he cannot release. But the important point is not whether the ring definitively solves the ending. Inception is too carefully constructed for that to be the only purpose. The ring theory, like the top theory, gives the audience another rule to follow. It offers another piece of evidence to analyze. And that may actually strengthen the movie's central argument. We desperately want systems. We want clues. We want objective markers that tell us whether an experience is real. Because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. Nolan understands that instinct and turns it into the final trick. The movie gives us a puzzle and then gives us an emotional reason to stop solving it. That is why the ending works even without confirmation. Cobb does not need the top to tell him what his life means. He has already decided. And there is something beautifully circular about that decision. At the beginning, Cobb enters other people's dreams because he believes reality can be manipulated. To the end, he stops manipulating the moment and simply experiences it. The man who spent the entire movie controlling perception finally stops controlling his own. Perhaps that is the deepest form of awakening Inception offers. Not waking from a dream, waking from the need to know whether you are dreaming. One of the reasons Inception still feels different from many modern blockbusters is that its impossible images often begin with something very real. Christopher Nolan's approach was built around a simple principle. If an effect could be created physically, the production should seriously consider building it before replacing it with a digital image. That philosophy is most obvious in the famous hotel hallway fight. On paper, the sequence should be impossible. Arthur is fighting inside a corridor where gravity constantly changes because the van in the dream level above is falling. A completely computer-generated environment could have created the illusion relatively easily. Instead, the filmmakers constructed a massive rotating hallway set. The practical rig could rotate through a full 360 degrees, allowing the walls and floor to physically move around the actors. As the set rotated, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's body responded to actual changes in orientation. His movements were not simply composited onto a digital background. He was genuinely performing inside a changing environment. That physicality is visible. When Arthur pushes against a wall, it feels like the wall has weight. When his body drifts through the corridor, the movement has momentum. When the camera follows him, the space appears to obey a consistent physical system, even though that system is completely unnatural. The result is an illusion created from reality. The same philosophy appears in the Paris cafe sequence. Cobb and Ariadne sit inside a dream environment. When the subconscious begins breaking apart around them, objects explode outward. Tables, chairs, glass, and fragments of the environment appear to launch into the air. Rather than making every element entirely in CGI, the production used practical effects, including nitrogen gas cannons, to create powerful bursts that could interact with the actors and physical surroundings. The effect matters because the actors are responding to something. Their bodies react to pressure, movement, noise, and debris. The camera captures those reactions instead of asking digital artists to manufacture every detail afterward. That does not mean Inception avoids CGI. Quite the opposite. A film involving impossible cities, dream transitions, collapsing architecture, and multiple realities requires extensive visual effects. Double negative and other visual effects artists played a crucial role in creating the final images. But CGI was generally treated as a tool for enhancement and compositing, rather than an automatic replacement for physical filmmaking. A real environment could be expanded digitally. A practical explosion could be combined with computer-generated elements. A miniature could be integrated into a larger environment. A physical performance could be surrounded by imagery that could never exist in front of a camera. The audience does not necessarily know where the practical effect ends and the digital effect begins. That is precisely why the approach works. The Snow Fortress sequence provides another example. The production built physical elements of the environment in Calgary, creating a tangible foundation for the action before visual effects expanded the scale and destruction. When the fortress is attacked and eventually destroyed, the sense of weight comes from combining practical construction, miniatures, controlled explosions, and digital augmentation. The audience is therefore not watching a purely digital building disappear. We are watching a physical object being transformed into a cinematic illusion. This distinction becomes especially important in a film about dreams. The story is constantly asking us to believe in things that cannot exist. If every impossible environment looked obviously artificial, the illusion would collapse. Nolan instead gives the audience physical evidence. The hallway rotates. The actors move through it. The Snow Fortress has texture. The explosions create real reactions. The camera has something tangible to photograph. And then visual effects quietly expand those physical foundations beyond what reality allows. That combination creates a strange paradox.